dbms important questions part 2 SQL. What are the types of integrity constraints in SQL? This is question number 4. And a question can also be asked like, define the types of constraints in SQL. So, the constraints are nothing but the rules for the data in the table. When the table is created at that time, we can define the constraints. That means we are defining the rules when the table is being created. That means at the physical level. So the concept of different types of levels in database management system, this video was already taken. You can watch and the link is provided in the I button. So now coming back to the concept, the constraint can be column level. That is, we can impose a constraint on the column and the table level. So usually as is already said, we define the rules for the attributes. That means for the columns. So at what type of constraints that we will be seeing, what are the different types of constraints and what are the types of constraints imposed for the attribute. So now let's move on to the main topic, that is integrity constraints. So what is meant by integrity constraint? Integrity constraints are the protocols that a table's data column must follow. So what is that? Columns of the table must be followed. So what type of constraint is that? That is integrity constraint. So why should we go for an integrity constraint? So these constraints actually are used to restrict the types of information that can be entered in the table. For example, when I speak about the attribute called as age or a column called as age. So what type of data can be entered in this? Only the numerics or the integers, isn't it? So this is a rule that we are implying for the column age. So that is what about the integrity constraints. So here there are two types of integrity constraints we are going to discuss. The first one is the domain constraint. So what is meant by domain constraint? It is defined as the set of all unique values permitted for an attribute. So let's try to understand this using an example. That is, assume we have the attribute called as date. So the attribute date or a column date. So what type of data it has to allow? So this should allow only all the set of possible valid dates. So whatever the dates that I am going to enter in this the column date in the table, that should always allow the valid date. You can't go for the values which are not at all under the category of date. So for example, if I take month should be between 1 to 12. So it can't be beyond or below that value. So those are called valid kind of dates. So this kind of constraint what we are imposing over an attribute is called as the domain constraint. So in simple I can say domain constraint is nothing but the data type plus the rules that you are imposing. Okay, so what are the different types of domain constraints we have? The first one is not null, second one unique, primary key, foreign key, check, default. So here we will be discussing one more thing, that is in operator. Okay, so let's see each of these constraints one by one. The first constraint what we are going to discuss in this video lecture is primary key. So what is meant by a key? That we already know. Any attribute that makes the data unique is called as a key. So, and if we have a set of keys like key 1, key 2, key 3, we will be selecting any one key as a primary key and we will be using that key for referring to a table, isn't it? So what are the rules that we need to take care while defining a primary key is that the primary key should not be null at any case and there should not be any duplication of these values in the primary key. Okay, so now the question is how to define the primary key in the table creation part. So that means when you create a table and fix the attribute, so how can I define the primary key, whether a particular attribute is a primary key or not? Okay, so before that, keep in mind this is at the physical level. So very important thing, you need to know all the levels of database design, and you should also know about the different languages in database so that you can understand this concept very clearly. So when coming to the primary key is defined at the physical level. That is, when designing of the schema, we'll select one attribute or one key attribute as a primary key. So let's move on to the syntax and see how to define that. So first one, create table. So look into the command create. So which language this create belongs to? Create belongs to DDL, data definition language. Okay. So create, and what object am I selecting here? This object is table. Okay. Again, the video I'll be providing link in the I button. You look into the different languages and their respective commands. Okay. So now once I create the table, I'm fixing the name for the table as person details. Now look into the bracket. What are the attributes do I have here? The first one is Aadhaar number, and what is this int here? I'm fixing the Aadhaar number should be an integer. That means the data type. So next one is the first name. Okay, first name should be a variable character, that is varchar in bracket 20, and you already know what is this 20 in my previous lecture. In data types, there we have spoke what is that n value speaks about. 20 is nothing but the maximum length of the data or the characters that is allowed. Same way, middle name varchar 20, next one address varchar 30. So I have around 1 2 3 4 attributes over here, and among these 4 attributes is very clear, like I can take only the Aadhaar number as a key here. Okay, so I have only one key, and that one key I'm selecting as a primary key. That you have to mention at the end, saying primary key bracket Aadhaar number and close, and finally end up all the queries with the semicolon. Okay, so this is how you have to define the primary key. Next one is the foreign key constraint. So what is meant by a foreign key? Any key that refers to the second table is called as, or the other table is called as a foreign key. In very simple, the key or which is common in both the tables can be taken as foreign key, because this one key is helping me to link up two or more tables. So when I say table 1 and table 2, I'll be linking this both the tables using foreign key. If I don't have foreign key, that means that each table is acting independently without any link between. Then you can't retrieve the data from both the tables. If you have a query to fetch which depends on table 1 as well as table 2, in that case you can't write a query if the foreign key is not existing. Okay, that is the importance of foreign key here. Okay, so now foreign key for one table is actually a primary key of the other table. And next, the table containing foreign key is called the child table. For example, if I speak about table 2, which has a foreign key, then I call table 2 as a child table, and the table containing candidate primary key is called parent table. Okay, so this is table, can't excuse. Okay, so if I assume table 1 is having a primary key, so that is called a parent table, PP. Okay, if a table is having the foreign key inside it, that is called as a child table. Simple. So let's move on to the example directly, how to refer to a foreign key. So here I have two tables. What are those tables? Table employee, and the attributes of this one is employee ID, name, age. And there's one more table that is department, and the attributes are department ID, department name, and employee ID. Okay, so what happens here? If you check, if you clearly observe, there is one attribute which is common in both the table. What is that? Employee ID, employee ID. So I'm going to consider this employee ID as a foreign key of table department, and this department table is acting like a child table here, because I have foreign key in department table and employee ID is present in employee table, which is acting like a parent table. Clear? So now how to define the foreign key? That syntax we'll see here. Create table department. So here only we have to fix the constraint. What constraint? Foreign key constraint. So that one, employee department. So where do I find the foreign key? In the department table. So that department you have to mention here, not the employee table. Okay. Create table department and the attributes are department ID, int, department name, varchar of characters 20, employee ID of integer, and what is the primary key of this one? There's only one key existing, so that same key I'm taking as the primary key. And I should also refer to a foreign key. What is the foreign key? Again, employee ID. That employee ID is common among both the tables, isn't it? So that employee ID I'm mentioning as a foreign key. And now I have to say to which table this particular foreign key is linked up. That linking part I am referring by the keyword references. Foreign key, mention name of the attribute and then say references, and after references go on to the table to which it is linked. That means department is linked to employee, so that employee you mention over here. That is table parent table. Okay, and then mention again the attribute name, that is employee ID inside that. In very short, I can say foreign key, employee ID, and this foreign key is referring to the table employee, that is linking up to the table employee. For that, use references, mention name of the table employee, and in bracket again go for the employee ID. Hope the concept is clear. So remaining part of the constraints we'll see in the next video lecture.